This one comes from my good friend Stefan. Yo, bud. Saw your dad at the laundromat this morning. Love that dude. I've got a ghost story for you. I grew up at the top of Broad Street in Nevada City, across from the St. Canice Cemetery, and experienced some weird stuff over the years. At night, my bed would shake, and a bellowing sound would accompany it. But sometime in high school, I figured out that it was actually my dad smoking pot and doing laundry. The dryer was shaking the house. Kind of funny, but not my ghost story. The apparition I saw appeared only a few times. The first was 1991. Early in the morning before school, I felt a tickle run across my skin as I observed a body of light flash through the house. I followed it and couldn't quite see clearly what it was, but as I blinked, I could make out the shape of a man running, wearing shorts and a loose-fitting shirt. This running man cruises through the kitchen, our living room, and out through the closed front door. Initially, I was terrified, but the apparition really didn't feel dangerous and seemed oblivious to my presence. But through the years I lived in that house, I saw this dude of light jog through our house numerous times, and while trippy, I eventually felt pretty good about the Rando Visitor. Warm regards to you, bro. Feel hugged and high-fived. And this one comes from my good friend Katie. So many ghost stories, but my favorite was about a haunted house I lived in as a teenager in Nevada City. It was a Victorian-era farmhouse built for a young woman who apparently died as a result of picking apples in their backyard in the 1890s. Both myself, my sister, and my mom could see her. She would walk up and down our hallway in a Victorian-era dress and turn the TV off in the middle of the night for some reason. But the creepy thing she would do, which I honestly enjoyed, is she would come into my room. I could tell because I could feel this warmth. She was kind. She would then whisper in my ear, "I'm here." She still lives in the house, haunting the current tenants in the sweetest way possible. Her second story. My dad was a park ranger at Empire Mine, and we lived in a state house inside of the mine yard. This is how I developed my sixth sense. There were evil spirits on the grounds, but I could always feel the ghosts of the fallen miners trying to protect the house. When I was 9, I was home alone and heard a loud bang on the front porch, which shook the entire house. There was absolutely no one and nothing there. It was probably one of the most terrifying experiences I have ever had. There would also be mine sounds in the middle of the night, like post hole digging and other unexplainable occurrences, which would generally happen when one of us was home alone, almost as if to scare us even more. These two spooky tales come from my friend Jay. I was about 5, and in my room, out of nowhere, my uncle appears kind of glowing in my room. In his hands, he had a toy ice cream truck and a toy train. The next morning was Thanksgiving, and the phone rang. It was my grandparents calling from Florida to let my dad know that sometime early in the morning, my uncle had taken his own life. 2 weeks later, I got a package with the 2 toys in it from my uncle. The second story. The other had to do with a house I purchased where the owner had killed herself. 2 separated incidents in the home. Once there was a pencil on the counter, I could hear it rolling, and it hit the ground. I went to pick it up, but it was already back on the counter. Another time, as I awoke in the morning, my youngest had gotten out of her bed. She wasn't but 2, laying on the couch with a blanket, perfectly folded into 4s, and placed on top of her. No one in the house did it. My other kids were still young and couldn't have done it. It wasn't me or the wife, so where did this perfect blanket come from? This next spooky tale comes from Cemetery Visits with Jim. Back in late 1916, in a fairly large hollow in West Virginia, 2 young fellows were competing for the hand of a beautiful young lady named Ellen. Now, one fellow named Asbury was a poor coal miner, had very little to offer Ellen, but he was handsome and really kind-hearted. The other was a fellow named Carpenter. He was fairly well-to-do, as far as money was concerned, and although he wasn't kind-hearted or handsome as Asbury, Ellen knew marrying him she'd be set, but probably not loved or treated well. Deciding on one was really difficult for young Ellen. Now, this little contest for Ellen's hand went on for some time until the United States decided to enter the World War in Europe. Asbury was drafted. Carpenter, with some high-level connections, wasn't drafted. Before Asbury was set to leave, he had a conversation with Ellen, and especially Carpenter, and a gentleman's agreement was reached. The agreement was simply this. Asbury said, Ellen is to wait until the war is over to make up her mind for whom she is to marry, and Carpenter is to not try and force her to decide until the war is over. Swear on your life, Carpenter. Carpenter agreed to this mountain code and indeed swore upon his own life. Well, Carpenter wasted little time in trying to win Ellen's hand after Asbury left for Europe. Every time Ellen reminded him of the agreement, he swore to uphold with Asbury. Some weeks go by and Ellen hadn't received any news from Asbury for some time, which was unusual because Asbury wrote to her once a week ever since he left for the war. And on this day, Carpenter was paying her a visit, still trying to get her to pick him, when suddenly she sees a fellow who left the hollow for the war the same time Asbury did, walking up the road. Ellen and Carpenter ran to greet this young man and noticed his arm was missing. They asked how he was. The young fellow said, well, minus the arm, I guess I'm okay. Ellen asked, how is Asbury? He hasn't written me in weeks. The young fellow said, well, Ellen, I'm surprised the military hasn't yet notified his family, but the same bomb that took my arm took Asbury's life. I'm sorry, Ellen. The young man continued on, walking towards his home. Now Carpenter was so happy, he says, well, now the choice is clear. I guess we can be wed now, Ellen said. The agreement was when the war ended, remember? Well, after some time, Carpenter did convince Ellen to marry him, yet the war was still waging in Europe, and on one cold winter day, Ellen was in the kitchen cooking dinner. Carpenter was in the living room by the fire, when suddenly a loud knock was heard at the door. Ellen thought it strange that visitors would come to the door in this weather. A foot of snow blanketed the area. She heard Carpenter say, come in. She heard the door open and Carpenter say, well, well, Asbury, I thought you were dead. Ellen in the kitchen gasped, then she heard a rifle shot. She quickly ran to the living room, seeing Carpenter shot through the chest, clearly dying on the floor. Looking at the door, she noticed the back of a mud-covered military uniform leaving out. She runs to the door and looking out sees muddy boot prints on the porch, not a soul around, and to her amazement, not one footprint in the surrounding snow at all. This might be too long, but I thought it was kinda cool. I first heard this story back in 1977. Jim, it was cool, and no, it wasn't long enough. This next story comes from Heather. I work in a Carnegie Library built in 1918. In the mid-90s, it was added on to take up the entire block. The interior was modernized, and they added a grand event space that hosts weddings, proms, etc. Also of note is the streets in the downtown area of Sacramento were built up due to flooding, so the basements are what was the main floor of the buildings. And there are tunnels under the modern sidewalks. You can still see windows and entry doors in the basement of the library. I have heard many ghost stories from library staff over the years, including service dogs in training barking at particular corners in the basement of what was once an old demolished hotel, to a custodian seeing a full-body apparition in another part of the basement. But this is the story that gives me the best chills. When there is a morning event in the library galleria, the on-call crew can work late into the night or very early in the morning to set up. One early morning, a new member of the crew named Jason was in the basement waiting for the freight elevator to load some furniture when he heard a banging come from the door of the offices down the hall. This area would have been the sidewalk area before the buildup. Jason assumed someone was locked in the room, so he called down to them. I'm sorry, I don't have a key. I'll go upstairs and get one and come right back to let you out. The banging continued, so he called again. Be right back. But the banging continued. When he got upstairs, he told the other employee, Seth, that someone was locked in an office downstairs, and he asked if he could borrow the master key to let them out. Seth informed Jason that absolutely no one else is in the building, and if there was anyone, they couldn't get locked in, since all office doors have panic hardware on the inside. Of course, when Jason got back downstairs, he realized what Seth said was true, that there could be no one inside the dark office, which freaked him out somewhat. Later that day, Jason was walking downtown when a man on the sidewalk asked him if he works at the library. Jason said he did and asked how he knew. The man said, because I see that library spirit following you. This next tale is by Audie. I accidentally bought a haunted ring once. It was a large ring of solid silver with a skull carved in it. It was the most impressive ring of its kind I have ever seen to this day. By no means a cheap trinket. It was in a case at an antique shop which was owned and operated by a huge and intimidating man. It was probably the only thing in that shop which was not an antique. I had never been to that shop before or since, and I don't even know the name of the tiny town it was in. The ring wasn't priced, so I asked. The large scary man, the owner, sold me the skull ring for only $5 despite the actual value of the ring being probably around $200 to $300, maybe more. It weighed like half a pound, I swear. In today's prices, it would easily fetch upwards of $600. Due to the extreme craftsmanship, I thought to myself, this is my lucky day. However, immediately after I gave him the money, he said, "If you only knew the things that ring has seen." I wore it on my pinky finger for about 30 years when I was in the Hells Angels, where I functioned as a high-ranking hitman. I killed people with that ring on. I beat people to death with that ring on. I watched people get tortured for days, and I always had that ring on. But I left that lifestyle several years back to open this shop and retire. I'm glad to see that ring go. Normally, if someone told me such a thing, I would probably not believe them, but it was clear he was telling the truth. I tried to sell it back to him then and there, but he just laughed an unsettling, dismissive laugh. Stupidly, I wore the ring every day for quite a while, because it really did look badass. But the roughly 2 years I wore that ring was probably the lowest, harshest point of my entire life. Though I didn't make that connection at the time, in fact, I considered that ring probably my most valued possession. During that time, I ended up living on the streets, disguised as a man among other things, but I wore that ring every day and I treasured it. To add to my bad luck, during that time, I developed a huge wart on the middle finger I wore the skull ring on. The first wart I'd ever had in my life, and no matter how aggressively and how diligently I treated that wart, it would just spring right back up. After a while, that finger, and only that finger, began to ache and crackle constantly. The knuckles of the finger started to swell. I attributed it to the stubbornly resilient wart which was on my inner knuckle, and it never occurred to me that it could be the ring causing these issues. But then one warm summer night, I was riding in my friend's car, gazing out the window at the kudzu-covered trees as they flew past like watchful giants in the dark. Those sultry nights joyriding, getting lost on the back highways, smoking cheap pot with good friends, the looming trees, music on, windows down, hot air in my face with my body shivering from the car's AC, was and is one of my favorite feelings in the whole world. I always felt the trees were looking back at us as we went careening past. I truly loved those moments. Not much conversation, just each of us with our thoughts. Divine. Anyway, on this particular night, suddenly, my reverie was interrupted by a small voice in my head saying, "The wart is from the ring. The skull ring is cursed. You have invited the curse into your life. His angry dead are following you now instead of him. Tricked you. Throw the ring out the window right now." And so I did. I threw it out into the blackness alongside some lonely country highway somewhere in Tennessee. I never even knew exactly where I was when I threw it. I could not have retraced my steps to find it if I tried for 100 years. But within 1 week of throwing it out that window, that wart went away all by itself. I had given up treating it by then, resigned to my permanent yucky little wart, and the crackling, aching pains in my fingers stopped entirely. My knuckles returned to their normal size. Neither the wart nor the pain and swelling ever returned. But sometimes I still worry because years later I recounted the story to a friend who claimed to be a psychic and to know a lot about these types of things. Her face fell and she said, "You should not have thrown it away like that. That is not the way to rid yourself of such a cursed object. You may still have his angry dead following you. You may have not truly alleviated the problem, and without that ring, you probably never will." Over the years, I read of a technique where such a curse of angry dead following you could be canceled, but it requires being buried alive overnight. It's strange though. I hadn't thought about that ring in a long time, but now I suddenly feel compelled to find someone who can help me, who can tell me whether or not I did the right thing, whether that huge, scary, wicked man's tortured, beaten ghosts are still somehow dogging my steps. I don't feel cursed anymore. In fact, quite the opposite. I feel remarkably blessed, but I just wonder sometimes.